everyone, and thank you for joining the Working Group 3 meeting for the Extended Day-Ahead Market Initiative, which focuses on greenhouse gas accounting and costs. I am Brenda Corona, representing the ISO Stakeholder Affairs Group, and I will be providing support for this meeting. I'm here today with Kevin Head, who will be continuing discussion on the resource-specific summary, and then at the end, Brian Jacobson will be the scribe for the working group to provide a recap on the discussion, and then Kevin will go over topics for this next meeting, which will be held on Tuesday from 1 to 3. A few meeting reminders for this working group is we will be having, this is intended for collaborative and encourage those to ask questions, share perspectives on the topics, and you feel free to raise your hand at any time, and Kevin will call on you. Once your line is unmuted, please start by stating your name and affiliation. And then for today's meeting, we will be using the polling located under the chat window where you may click your response anonymously throughout today's discussion. This meeting is recorded and we will post files on the corresponding working group webpage where you will find other materials related to this meeting. As well, a reminder, this recording and other related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And if you do have any follow-up questions after the meeting, please submit them through the inquiry link located on the resource slide at the end of the presentation. And you may also reach out to us via email. I'll turn it to Kevin Head to go over the meeting objectives and a few items on this agenda, and then we'll go ahead. Kevin?
Cool. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Working Group 3 for the Extended Day Ahead Market. Excited to move into the final 2 weeks after today's meeting. It's going to be, I think we've got a pretty busy agenda today. What I'm planning on doing is do a little brief review of the resource-specific summary that we posted earlier today, and then take the rest of the time to do a evaluation of the resource-specific approach using the design objectives that we had agreed upon early on in the working group's process. So, and then we'll turn it back to Brian to do a recap and talk about what's coming next. So, event producer, if you wouldn't mind making Kevin Head presenter I'll go over the goals. Sorry, Brenda, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. So we're going to spend the first part highlighting a couple of items in the resource-specific approach summary. Just one more, on today's objectives. Thanks. So we're going to highlight a couple of items in the resource-specific approach, and then we're going to do that working group evaluation. And that evaluation, it's not intended to try to get folks to take a formal stance on this approach or a different one. It's more meant to just understand where we're all at, try to understand whether there's anything impeding us to say, hey, we like this one or we don't like the other one. And I think it'll provide a good debate to do some more of the qualitative impressions of the approach. So with that, I will take presenting rights and talk through one document for the next 10 minutes or so, and then we will move on. So let me share my screen. All right, cool. So this is a document that was posted onto the working group website, and it's the resource-specific approach summary, effectively. And what the CAISO policy team has done is fill in the working group revised scope document with the specifics of how the approach would work in the extended day ahead market. You'll remember I had done a similar exercise with the Western Energy Imbalance Market scope just to see what it might look like. So the ISO did something similar when presenting the resource-specific approach. So I think, well, first, thank you to the ISO policy team for taking that effort on. because I think this will be a really good resource for us in our evaluation today, and then looking back on it in the future as to what the various aspects are of this approach, at least as they stand at the beginning of March. You'll notice that there's a few TBD items in here. So I wanted to highlight a couple of the TBDs as well as clarifying one point. So I'm going to scoot down a bit longer. Okay. So I just want to highlight 3 points here. So the first point is that the baseline for attribution, which George had presented last week on Thursday, using the resource sufficiency evaluation solution as the baseline. The ISO's proposal is still to do that, but we are going to hear next, or rather on the 15th, so 2 weeks from now, how the approach might work differently, and that's going to be presented by WPTF, and they're going to talk a little bit about how a potential different approach to this might be, with the goal of more accurately attributing the greenhouse gas quantities based on an estimate of secondary dispatch. I believe that's what the presentation will be. And so I just wanted to highlight that this item is, in terms of the ISO's sort of approach that they laid out, is relatively settled. But I want to make sure that we as a working group don't close our minds to the idea that there might be something additional that we can talk about here. So moving on. The next thing I want to highlight is this is a TBD right here, and this is talking about bidding of greenhouse gas costs. And in the presentation that was given last week, it was assumed that I believe it was the between day ahead and real time. So there's a EDAM GHG bid that's submitted under the resource specific approach. That bid has 2 components, a price component and a megawatt component. In the real time market, that same thing exists today in the WEIM. But in the proposal that was given last week, it was proposed that if you receive a day ahead award, that you can change your megawatt quantities, but not the price of that GHG bid. I want to highlight that they let me know that they're still actually workshopping that idea. So it might look like it was a settled issue, but it's still TBD. So I just wanted to highlight that. And then the third point is, it wasn't explicitly spelled out in the presentation last week, but the question is basically, do we need to make changes to the WEIM's real-time model to align it with EDAM? And 2 of the things that the ISO anticipates to change with the WEIM approach is 1, updating the area from balancing area, which is currently used today, the sort of unit of account, or how they decide whether or not you are a GHG zone. They're proposing to change that in both the extended day ahead market and in the WEIM's real-time market to be based on the GHG regulation area. And this is something that's been spelled out in the context of the EDAM, but this is sort of a new proposal for the WEIM. And then the next would be to augment or further constrain the greenhouse gas attribution in the WEIM to limit the GHG attribution to the EDAM BAA, or in the case of the real-time market, the WEIM BAA net export transfer schedule. So these are 2 things that the ISO is proposing to leverage the EDAM conversations we've been having and move it into the WEIM. So those are the three things that I wanted to highlight. Can anybody, if anybody has any questions, will you let me know, raise your hand, and I can talk them through. See if we have any hands raised. All right, I see that Kathleen Colbert has her hand up. Kathleen, would you please go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Thanks for going through that. My question goes back to the beginning. I actually missed your framing of the exercise we're doing today. Can you restate your goal for the conversation? Thank you for this, by the way.
Yeah, I'll definitely get into it a little bit more in the next section. So just can you hold on to that, and we'll come back to it in 5 minutes, just so we're.
Well, maybe I can ask it differently, perhaps. You're going through and adding open questions. I'm trying to figure out what you just did, the purpose behind what you just did.
Oh, okay. This was to just highlight three things that are sort of either incrementally different from what was presented last week, or I wanted to make sure that we're not considering this issue right here to be fully settled in terms of the working group, because we will a second conversation about this on the 15th.
Okay, thank you for repeating that. Yeah, I just wasn't getting the context for going through it, so I appreciate anchoring me, and hopefully others. Hopefully I'm not the only one who's a little confused. But I also wanted to throw out, if you don't mind, so on the baseline, we've been doing a lot of thinking on what this baseline run will look like. I've been calling it the baseline run. And I have my own ideas for how the baseline run would function, and it's one that is not siloed into this working group, but it spans all the working groups, or at least one other, and has multiple different benefits that I think it can be used for. I don't actually know the path forward to provide that feedback, so I had kind of anticipated there would be ability for stakeholders to provide feedback on the concepts that you guys have been presenting on in a more formal way, to share with you our proposals or suggestions. I'm happy to hear WPTF is doing that, but is there a space for others to also do that?
Yeah, I mean, that's what the work, well, it depends. So are you proposing a new approach to the issue, or are you wanting to provide qualitative feedback that would be like put in comments to a straw proposal? Because we will have the kickoff.
Yeah, no, what I plan to do, I'll crowdsource it, is to put together a straw man and circulate it to CAISO staff for consideration, and then ask for whether or not you would like to bring some of those concepts forward on your own into a working group meeting, or if you would like us to present that to the working group. I think it has been, so I'm trying to think of the best, most effective way to have productive conversations on these topics. I was coming up with the idea of maybe first presenting it to you and Anna and others, getting initial feedback, and then once you believe it's right, then bringing it forward to the group for their feedback. But if you have a different route that you would prefer, I think this is a good time to, kind of clarify that.
Yeah, I think we would hope that you could submit the request for a meeting through the SurveyMonkey tool that we have. That'd be helpful. And then if you want to present in one of the meetings, we can just work on scheduling that at a later point after you've made that request. And if it's one that spans across multiple groups, we'd try to maybe figure out which one it best fits into. Does that answer your question?
Sort of. I think the SurveyMonkey is fine. They'll probably send you an email to ask for a meeting if that's all right with you. I think that as far as requesting a meeting, I mean, I'm happy to say, hey, can I have some space on an agenda coming up at a meeting? I have been doing that frequently and I haven't found it to be uber productive. So that's why I'm looking for the CAISO to make it a little clearer how you want to get feedback, meaningful feedback from stakeholders. And maybe I can echo something that one of my colleagues over in 6 Cities, Bonnie Blair, frequently says that I think is well said. It is really hard to get feedback in this venue that is meaningful and specific. And it's also hard to say, hey, here's an idea I want you to consider, because it's really been structured as here's our proposals, give us feedback, and not, hey, what does the stakeholder community think? I just think we really need a space for what do stakeholders think in the spirit of a working group and us all working together. So I'll be in touch offline.
Yeah, I mean, I would disagree with that characterization, but if others feel differently, I'd encourage you to raise those thoughts. I mean, this working group in particular has had an entire new approach offered, and we've followed that thread and continued to do so. So I'm not sure if that's a broader comment on all of the working groups or if it's specific to this working group, but I hope that I haven't given off the impression that this is a closed door or closed meeting, because I felt that we've had pretty broad participation and lots of new novel ideas presented. So
no, and I don't want you to take what I just said negatively, Kevin. I'm trying to, and there have been requests made, hey, can we have an opportunity to kind of submit comments that might be public where we could share, entities' opinions, people have brought forward proposals. You have been actually very receptive. So I do not want you to walk away from what I just said. I just am trying to figure out the time that we have remaining. Where's the space to then have more engagement? I hear you saying it's open, but I'm looking at a dwindling timeline. And so I'm trying to figure out practically how we're going to ensure that we now have the iterative conversations that we need.
Okay, well, let me take that feedback internal and shoot it over. Thank you. All right, Claire also had her hand up. Claire, would you please go ahead?
Thanks, Kevin. This is Claire Bryden from the Western Power Trading Forum. Very briefly, I know you got a lot to get through today. I was wondering if you could hold 5 minutes at the end of us walking through this before you go to wrap up. We have an ask of ISO staff, and I'd like a few minutes at the end to be able to discuss it, so just for your planning.
Okay, yeah, so this is just the first part of the conversation. We're going to do the working group evaluation after that point. So is it related to this document that was posted, or is it related to the evaluation of the resource-specific approach that we'll be doing, or something new entirely?
It's related to the evaluation, and the concern that we have, and WPTF has said that we don't have a preference necessarily at this point between the resource-specific approach or the zonal approach. But the concern we have is that we don't feel that we can, as stakeholders, fully evaluate and compare the two approaches and any other approaches or ideas that are out there without seeing a quantitative analysis and some testing. In other words, take some mock-up scenarios, build a little model, and show us how they compare across the zonal approach and the resource-specific approach, both with respect to system-wide emissions, resources that are deemed, and what the emissions are that are attributed to the greenhouse gas zone, and then what the different approaches mean for price formation and the difference in LMPs within the greenhouse gas zone and without. So the ask is for some quantitative testing and presentation of a comparison before we as stakeholders are asked to effectively evaluate or compare the two or more approaches.
Okay, I'm receptive to that. I'm in the market analysis group. I like doing the data analysis, and I agree that having that side-by-side comparison would be useful. But I don't think that we need that necessarily at this point, because we can assess the ideas qualitatively and then have the quantitative aspects filled in later. And just to level set, I don't think that it's realistic to put that together in the 2 weeks that we have remaining in the working groups. I don't want to promise anything in the straw proposal phase, but that, policy process is a much longer term, effort that there will potentially be time for those side-by-side comparisons at that point. But I think your point is well taken, and it's something that I also want to see. So hear me out, see how the evaluation goes today. And if you feel that the quantitative aspect of it is absolutely crucial before we proceed, let's raise that at the end. But point taken, Claire. Thank you. Vijay, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I don't have questions. I want to first thank you for all the work you guys have been doing. And I'm not trying to just respond to Kathleen's comment, but building on Claire and Kathleen, you just said the right words. It's a straw proposal. So this is meant to be a qualitative brainstorming of ideas on the ideological approach. Let's not make precision the enemy of good. So that's my one other big request. We already delayed this EDAM effort for 1.5 years. So this is phenomenal work being done. The only other suggestion I want to give, if it helps Claire, is once the two approaches are fully fleshed out, if there is a discussion that is, I totally agree with Kathleen in the spirit of an open engagement. Maybe one meeting could be dedicated to be where all of, especially market participants who have more, impact on the financial end, we have an impact from a public sector end, is present deal breaker concerns on each side. If you don't go this route, what are the big issues you're going to have? That's what everyone needs to know. What are the trade-offs we're going to deal with? This is all about trade-offs. Let's do a trade-off impact review rather than going to the nitty-gritty of financials, because once we get into a quantitative assessment, we're going to get into the underbelly of assumptions. So then it all becomes a case-specific situation. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And I hope that we've raised some of those today, because I do want us to have some of those conversations publicly. I recognize that people might need time to chew them over, but hopefully we can at least do some of that chewing as a group, so our jaws don't get tired. I don't know, but the idea behind today will be to hopefully do that evaluation. So let me take that as a cue to segue into the second half of the conversation. What I've done here is these are the 7 design objectives that we have discussed as a group, and we had agreed upon early on in this process. And let me just get it properly sized. So what I hope to do is to do a working group evaluation of the resource-specific approach against these design objectives. And in doing so, I'm not trying to get folks to take a formal stance of these approaches, but I want to have some of those conversations that you folks were just mentioning. What's the merit of this? What are the trade-offs here? Those types of things. I think that the design objectives that we have are relatively effective at capturing the ideas behind those trade-offs. And what I want to do is go through it, get a sense of where the broader group is, and remind folks to, that exactly as Vijay said, this is a brainstorming session. We're supposed to be getting our thoughts out on paper, but there will be a chance for more formal comments when the ISO's policy team takes this over and publishes its policy papers on this. So how I propose to do this evaluation, and again, this is up for debate. We are a working group here. So the idea here is, first, I have each of these 7 design objectives, and I want to characterize how the design objective could be met. And let me give you an example of what I mean by that. So this first design objective is that there shouldn't be an inappropriate or unacceptable GHG impact in a non-GHG zone. So what I've done is added my own thoughts as a starting point. This doesn't have to be a formal, this isn't the working group's opinion. I just thought instead of having blue sky to look at, we would have something concrete to work off of. And being an economist and a market analyst, I thought of it in terms of prices. So is there a inappropriate or unacceptable price impact to the non-greenhouse gas zone because of these GHG prices, and in particular, the resource-specific approach? I encourage folks to hop in and say, well, prices are one aspect of it, but did you think about this? And I want to have those conversations and try to document those in this Word document. I recognize that I'm sort of myopic and you guys have a lot of different perspectives, and the idea is to get some of those down into this document. Then I have a 5-point rating scale here where, I want to characterize at least an initial characterization of how well this design objective is met by the resource-specific approach. So if it's perfectly or near perfectly met, we would give it a high. If it's barely met or not met at all, we would give it a low. And then we can open up the call. We're not going to make that judgment initially, but we can open up the call to say, hey, I'm Frank from utility X. I think it's moderately met here. I think this would fall into a medium because X. And have some of those discussions. And then we've set up a poll in WebEx that the event producer, Shreyas, will start up once we've sort of closed the floor to discussion and debate. And the idea is that this can bring in folks who don't normally provide verbal comments, but want to provide some sort of feedback into the process. And that poll result isn't going to be like a binding determination of what the working group thinks, but it'll be interesting at least to see where the group's at and get a broader swath of opinions than normally can be represented in just discussion and debate. So I wanted to, well, first I'll go through and read the design objectives, all 7 of them, just to remind us on where to go. And then I'll open up the call just to see if folks have any sort of logistical questions of how I'm proposing to run this evaluation. And we'll take it from there. So I'll read through the design objectives and then let you folks hop in if you have any questions about how the evaluation should go down or suggestions on a different approach. So the first design objective is that the approach should not have an inappropriate or unacceptable GHG impact in a non-GHG zone. Second is that leakage should be minimized. Third is that it should enable similarly situated or similar technology resources in a non-GHG zone to compete on a level playing field with resources inside the GHG zone and vice versa. Fourth is that the approach should not inadvertently undermine renewable portfolio standards and clean energy standard policies. Fifth is that it should allow for market efficiency by accurately reflecting relevant costs, including GHG compliance costs. Sixth is that it should seek simple solutions where possible while balancing precision and implementation feasibility to support state policy objectives. And then the last one is that it should be a durable market design, including but not limited to allowing for future policy designs and potential linkage. So I'll head up back to the top and see if folks have any questions, but the general outline of what I'm thinking is just a refresher. One, characterize what are the elements we should be thinking about in assessing whether the design objective should be met. 2, we'll have a debate about how well it is met, and we can have folks raise their individual opinions on this. And then 3rd, we'll open up the poll and give folks who didn't get a chance to weigh in a chance to put in their choices there. And when we open up the first poll, I'll talk a little bit about how the logistics of that might work. And I will give Alva a chance to ask his question. Shreyas, if you wouldn't mind unmuting Alva Svoboda, please.
Hello, this is Alva Svoboda, PG&E. I wanted to, so I'll just quickly, because I think it's not quite I'm not able to keep so many things in mind in terms of the meeting structure at once. I wanted to respond to your first proposal, which is, in my mind, prices are information and should be correct information, and the aim of this design objective should be cost impact rather than impact specifically on prices. I don't know what the correct prices should be, and it may be that there are, and in fact, I think there probably are concerns with how you represent prices so that they correctly represent the incentives in the different zones. But I don't think that the objective should be no impact to prices in a non-GHG zone. I think the objective should be no impact to cost.
Yeah, we'll get into that in just a second, but point well taken. Does anyone have questions about how we'll perform the evaluation before we get into doing the evaluation itself? The next hand I saw up was Bonnie Blair. Bonnie, can you go ahead?
Bonnie Blair, representing the Six Cities Group. Yeah, I have a question about your polling process. I think it's kind of it's an interesting solution to kind of the inability of everybody to speak in a meeting. But I have a question. What if your reaction on a particular objective, or how well a feature meets the objective, is I don't really know yet because I need more information about how it would work? Is it possible to include that kind of a reaction in the poll? Because it seems to me that, certainly as to some of these, that's where I am at the moment.
Okay. Well, first, let me ask the event producer, Shreyas, is it too late to add an additional response to the polling question?
I can add it.
Okay. Yeah, can we add a 6th potential response, which is not enough information to respond, please?
Okay.
That'll be great.
All 7 questions.
That's
yeah,
great.
thanks.
Thanks.
But, so Bonnie, though, while I have you, if you wouldn't mind, as we go through this, if you're unclear about a particular aspect of the resource-specific approach, to raise that as a question in real time or during the conversation, so we can attempt to respond to it, because this design document, this summary, which I'm displaying here, has a lot of the detail of how the resource-specific approach might work. And during the evaluation, I'm expecting to come back to this document and say, how will multiple greenhouse gas areas be treated? Then we can consult this document to see if it addresses the question, and if not, identify that open area for further elaboration. Does that sound fair?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I, yeah, I can see that you might be able to clarify something during the course of the discussion that would allow somebody to come up with a, high to low type rating. And if that's possible, great. But I can also visualize that there might be other things where it was sort of, well, that really depends on the down in the weeds details, and we haven't gotten there yet.
Okay. Yeah. thanks. That's a good point. Okay, Callie Wells, would you please go ahead?
Hi, Kevin. It's Callie Wells with WPTF. Sorry for the delay to unmute there. So I guess I have a question as to how these polling results are going to be used. Is it the intent that you'll take a poll for all the options on the table and then use that as means to figure out which approach ends up in the straw proposal? Or is the idea that you're going to take kind of this initial measurement now, but all the options are still on the table on the straw proposal? And I guess the reason I'm asking is because it kind of goes back to the initial ask earlier about testing and getting some more quantitative analysis done so we can actually see how these function. Because if it is your intent to only go down to one option in the straw proposal, then I really think we need to, incorporate those testing and analysis before then. If the idea, and I might be persuaded differently if the idea is that all options are still on the table in the straw proposal, we'll still evaluate all that, then I guess I'm trying to understand kind of how these polling results will be used.
Yeah, they won't be used to take any options off the table. It's more of a mechanism to see how the broader community is thinking about a particular issue. We won't be showing results by individual people, so this won't, be WPTF's official position if you vote medium high on design objective 2 or something. It's just more meant to be like a temperature check of how well do we think the resource specific approach meets the design objectives. And in terms of taking both options into the straw proposal, I don't want to put that, I don't want to say we're going to only take one or take both. I'm expecting that we're likely going to take both into the straw proposal, but it's sort of once the working group has done our work, we'll have a chance to make that determination. So I don't want to call that too early on. Does that answer your question, Callie?
That does. That helps. And to be very clear, I think there is extreme value in kind of what Claire mentioned earlier and having some sort of testing done, some analysis done on these. I think that's really when you're going to get, I guess, a higher quality ability to make the trade-offs between all the proposals, just because from the very beginning, it's, I think everyone's agreed there's no perfect solution to this. So I really think that there is value in the testing. I'm just trying to figure out, what the use of these polls are going to be and how that testing can fold into these results.
Okay. Yep. Cool. Well, thanks. All right. Anybody else have any logistical questions before we get started? I'm not seeing any hands raised. All right. So let's dig into the first design objective here. So the first design objective is that there should be no inappropriate or unacceptable GHG impact in a non-GHG zone. And like I mentioned, I think of it in terms of prices, and maybe a different way of characterizing this, as Alba brought up, would be costs. So let me explain my thinking behind prices to give folks a chance to understand how I'm sort of thinking about chewing through these issues. So like I said, I wanted to look at the different transactions between a non-GHG zone and a GHG zone, and whether, through the extended day ahead market, and see whether it has a price impact on the non-GHG zone. And the thinking here is, if the generation is in a non-GHG zone, but the sink is in a GHG zone, so the load is in a GHG zone, is there a price impact to the non-GHG zone? The answer is no, there isn't, because the model is specifically designed to have the load in the non-GHG zone pay an LMP that does not include the GHG component of the LMP. whereas the GHG zone load, which in this case is the one being served, the LMP paid by the GHG zone load includes that component of the GHG of the LMP related to the GHG price. On the other hand, the source of the generation is in the GHG zone, and it's delivered to the non-GHG zone. Is there an LMP impact? In this case, there's no explicit LMP impact to the non-GHG zone. However, the exports from the GHG zone, all things equal, may be more expensive because of the fact that they have a carbon price in that GHG zone. That carbon price is imposed based on where it's produced in the GHG zone. So it's sort of implicit in the cost of that electricity, and it's a result of the policy and is effectively outside of the ISO's purview as an energy market regulator. So there's no explicit LMP impact, but there is a cost impact. So that's how I think about it. So, in thinking about this question, I don't see any inappropriate or unacceptable GHG impacts. But again, I was only looking at this through the perspective of prices. So does anyone else have a different perspective on this? And maybe, Alva, this is when you could raise your point about costs. So let me call on Alva just to give him a chance to help me understand a little bit more of what he was thinking. So Alva, would you go ahead?
Yeah, just quickly, the price in the ISO market is, just looking at it, first of all, just in terms of the daily market, it's the cost of an incremental megawatt at a given location, right? That's the basic definition of price. If that megawatt can potentially serve in two different ways, then it is there is going to be an effect on price by virtue of that, and you want visibility on that in some way. And I'm just essentially just responding to your point as a point of argument, not in detail, because I don't know the detail. But the other point I would make is that, even more importantly, perhaps, the daily market is a repeated market, and so you want signals out of the prices that are reflecting the decisions that are going to be consistently made over time by the market participants. And again, if you kind of mask information, you risk leading either to decisions that aren't transparent or bad decisions. So I think that doesn't necessarily mean there shouldn't be separation of prices between the zones. And I think if that's all you're talking about, then that's a correct outcome, actually, of both of the models. But that there would be no impact, that you could demonstrate there's no impact on the margin between the use of a megawatt in a GHG zone or not, I think would be very difficult to show, and it shouldn't be a design objective.
Did you want to talk about the costs point?
Well, and I think it's actually embedded in another of your objectives. I think it's absolutely, legitimate and necessary that non-GHG zone loads be assured that they are not paying a higher price, or overall not on the margin, for electricity because of what the dispatch in the GHG zone. That's going to be an important thing for this to be a sustainable model. So maybe we're talking about prices in two different ways, but I think of prices in terms of LMPs and the kind of the signaling part of it. Maybe we're just thinking in terms of what's the price paid for energy by loads in the two zones. And in that case, your point would be the same as mine, that there shouldn't be an impact that non-GHG zone participants would feel to be unfair, or the GHG zone participants would feel to be unfair, resulting from the market structure.
Cool. Okay, thanks, Alva. We've got next hand up was Kathleen Colbert. Kathleen.
Sure, great. Thanks, Kevin. This is Kathleen Goldberg from Vistra. Based on the feedback I heard earlier, I'm going to share my perspectives on this call. That's what I heard you say. Okay, so I'm also, because I'm looking at the objectives, and I think this is the best one to include accuracy in as well. But I can't find another one that jumps out at me unless you can direct me in a different direction.
Are you saying accuracy in terms of how well we quantify?
Just methodology, just being a good design.
Okay, yeah. Let's hear that.
Is probably the best one? Okay. So I'll start with the baseline. So in order to even be comfortable that there's no kind of inappropriate or unacceptable impact, I think it's really critical that we have confidence in the baselines that are being used. Mm-hmm. And so I'm adding that. I don't disagree with you, price impact matter. Like having the loads be charged at their D-labs a price that is consistent with the regulatory environment they're in is important. And I think you've captured it. On the question of what else needs to be talked about, what I think needs to be talked about is the accuracy of establishing that baseline for deeming resources and which resources are deemed has a meaningful impact to greenhouse gas impacts in a non-greenhouse gas region, as well as, frankly, the inverse in a greenhouse gas region. And I'll explain what I mean by that.
Okay.
And you can feel free to, this may be difficult to type. I will commit, maybe I shouldn't commit, but this was what I intended to give you a heads up on before doing this. But and you can see why. The reason I say that is that what we're really concerned about is a couple things. One is an equity issue on the non-greenhouse gas areas, where in a world without EDAM transfers, what is in the best equity interest for that area is if we were to use, so in a world without transfers, the least cost resources available to that area would be dispatched up to meet that area's load. Now, once you open up and say, okay, we can provide you incremental benefits of providing transfer capability through EDAM, it is really important that you respect just the equities issues within that area, not to assume that only the more expensive resources are serving that area's loads. I mean, this is one of the reasons that the deeming process is something that we see in the proposal that you're talking about. And I would clarify, I'm talking about the CAISO's resource-specific proposal. I think there'll be others put forward that may address this concern to some extent. And if not, I will put one forward. But in the CAISO's proposal, you're deeming resources that are clean, that would have been dispatched to meet that area's load absent of transfers. And that's an irrational outcome. And there is actually some challenges associated with that. This is not just a theoretical concern that we have. While an area that is quote unquote non-GHG may not be subject to greenhouse gas compliance on a state level or something like that, individual entities are encouraged and frankly incentivized under today's kind of environmental there are other reasons that entities are incentivized to want to be clean or to have a certain amount of their load served by clean resources that is outside of like a formal greenhouse gas compliance. I'm not encouraging or even suggesting that you capture that in this explicitly, but that is one of the reasons that there should be concern with making an assumption that the clean resources can be deemed first to go towards a greenhouse gas area, not only from a least cost perspective, but also from the idea that there could be entities within that area that are trying to meet their own goals they've set for themselves. And this is part of the reason that we feel very passionately that for a resource-specific approach to work, it has to start with the assumption that the resources that would have been dispatched to meet that area's load are not able to be deemed. Only when you open up the transfers, incremental dispatches above what that baseline would be should be eligible to be deemed for transfers out. It's the only way that we can see we respect the internal loads needs and their rights to that kind of resources as well. And if you don't mind, I want to round out my last thought, and then I'm going to pass it back to you. It's one sentence.
We're gonna have this conversation in 2 weeks, but go ahead.
No, that's fine. I heard that this was the time to give our feedback. So on the baseline run, I also have really strong positions on what the baseline run should look like to be accurate. So to be accurate, the baseline run that we can support is using the IFM model with 3 changes. The first change is it blocks transfers. The second change is it removes virtual supply. The third change is it replaces bid and demand with forecasts. IFM model, no transfers, removes virtuals, and it uses a forecast. I believe that run will produce a baseline that can be used that is more accurate to represent what we believe needs to be represented in this form. And that's why I mentioned it overarching. It can also be used in the other working groups, but I will discuss that with their facilitators. Thank you.
Thanks. So we have an alternate proposal to put into this design objective evaluation, which is that it should also assess whether the accuracy of establishing the baseline is a relevant point in terms of assessing whether or not there's an inappropriate or unacceptable GHG impact in a non-GHG zone. Does anyone support that idea or have a conflicting opinion or think that there is a different way of assessing this design objective that's not captured in either prices or this? Does anyone think this is a good metric to use to evaluate this design objective, a bad one, irrelevant? What do you folks think? All right, I see Doug Howe has his hand up. Doug, you want to go ahead?
You can hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, hi. This is Doug Howe, representing the PUC MOU group. Just very briefly, I think the idea that was brought up is a relevant one, particularly with respect to states that have RPSs and CESs, as we've talked about before. I would want to think about this a little bit more, but I think the idea that clean energy resources that are within the base schedule can't be deemed somewhere else. I think that idea might also solve Oregon and Washington's problem of whether or not the REC transfers if renewable energy is transmitted through EIM or EDAM transfers, which is going to be a problem that we have to solve one way or another. But again, I think I would want to think about that issue a little bit more, but I think there might be promise there.
Okay, and how would the establishing a baseline be an impact of a GHG zone to a non-GHG zone? Can you just help me connect the dots there?
I think it goes more to the issue that was just brought up, which is if a clean energy resource gets somehow it is in the base schedule or is in the forecast, let me put it that way, for a particular BA, and it's been put into that particular BA's forecast in order for it to meet its RPS or CES standards, and then having some of that deemed somewhere else calls into question whether or not the BA can meet its obligations under the RPS or the CES. So I think that's why this may solve this particular problem. But again, I'm not quite sure yet.
That's a function of the way that the model works, but that's not a greenhouse gas impact on the non-greenhouse gas zone, is it? It just seems that it's a...
I think what I'm reacting to is the deeming issue that was just brought up.
Okay.
If clean energy gets deemed away from a BA, which intended to attribute that clean energy to its own RPS or CES, then that's an outcome that could create problems.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, we have a separate design objective, which is that it doesn't inadvertently undermine RPS and clean energy standard policies. So maybe let's try to capture that in that one. But for the time being, I'm going to focus on the no inappropriate or unacceptable GHG zone impacts to a non-GHG zone. And the next hand I see up is Vijay. Vijay, would you go ahead?
Yes, thank you. I think Kathleen brings up a valid point in the sense that I'm taking a big risk here in conflating Kathleen's comment with Jeff Spires' comment 4-5 weeks ago on the deeming versus delivered. So I'm not sophisticated enough on the whole nuance of how the baseline is set and then when it gets dispatched and what happens, but I get the big picture problem being highlighted here. My comment is it should not be the accuracy of establishing baseline, but maybe like the clarity on the criteria or the decision logic for the baseline. It's not about the accuracy. It's about what is being presumed will be in the baseline versus what is actually happening. Accuracy is about getting the exact numbers right. But if that's what you mean this to be, that's okay. And my second comment, I'll wait for later, as you've said, even to Doug. I want to make a big comment of clarification. We are talking RPS and CES together when I think in this whole methodology, I think you all have proposed the optimization to only be with reflecting carbon pricing, not RPS requirements. So I urge caution on clubbing RPS and CES together when it comes to the policy aspects, because if RPS is not part of the optimization, why is that being grouped together? But that's a comment and a question for later, but I hope my comment on baseline makes sense. If not, it's okay. Thanks.
Thanks.
And Vijay WI.
Thank you. The next hand I saw up, Callie. So Callie, what do you think? How should we assess this design objective? Should it be through prices, accuracy of establishing the baseline, or some alternative approach? What do you think?
I was actually raised my hand too. I thought you posed a question on whether or not people, this idea of accuracy of the baseline. So I was going to opine on that, but I think.
Just to clarify.
Do you want me to hold off? Because it sounds like that might be put into another design objective.
Unless we think that it's relevant to the design objective about inappropriate or unacceptable GHG impact in a non-GHG zone.
I think it, I think it can be. I think it maybe overlaps a couple design objectives to the extent it has an inappropriate impact on the non-GHG zone is to the extent if you get that baseline inaccurate and it allows for some of the clean energy resources that would have been serving the non-GHG zone load to then be deemed delivered to serve the GHG loan. I think that's an impact that should be evaluated. But I think there might be an overlap. I think this accuracy of establishing a baseline could actually be part of a couple of your design objectives. But I think that is a feature that we should evaluate.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So just making sure I have an accurate count on the hands that are up. I see Alva, Kathleen, and Mary. We haven't heard from Mary today. Mary, do you want to go ahead?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
So just very quickly, I was going to kind of reiterate what Kath's saying. I think that idea of establishing the baseline here is in to evaluate how well the price impact objective is being and I will just stop there.
Okay,
to reiterate.
Maybe it's just my end, but you were breaking up a little bit. Would you mind just repeating that last sentence, please?
Sure. I've been having problems with my service all day So I will just say that I just wanted to kind of agree with what Kelly was just saying about the accuracy of the baseline being an important component of evaluating this design objective and maybe other design objectives as well.
Okay. Okay. I'll give Kathleen a chance to hop back in, maybe if I didn't capture this correctly, and then I want to open up the poll to see if we can put a rating on this at this point. So Kathleen?
Yeah, no, thanks, Kevin. I mean, mostly correctly. I would just say with with no EDAM transfers, it's worth including and without without virtual supply to meet load forecast. Just to be clear that you've captured what I said.
Okay.
Thank you. And then I did want to, and maybe this is a framing and you want to focus to try and help you focus on an impact rather than, because I agree that the accuracy of it is driving the price impact. It's driving other things. It's going to show up as really meaningful in other elements, but there is a impact that we consider inappropriate or unacceptable that is different than a price impact, which is a reporting impact. So if you want to add, maybe that's a clearer way to kind of capture what this is driving for both potentially price impact and reporting impact. But I'm not sure how this shakes out, and that's part of our concern. But for, in all areas have some sort of reporting requirement. So that I'm getting over my skis because I am not the environmental expert inside my company, but my understanding is that there are national requirements about reporting energy generation to the EIA and the EPA is what has been communicated to me. And so we need to be thinking about it as reporting requirements within every single area are still present from a national perspective, even if they're separate from some of the more detailed reporting discussions we've been having about greenhouse gas compliance. So the concerns that have been raised that we think are unacceptable is that if under today's world, an entity is reporting that it on net has a lower emission contribution, and that's what's being reported to EIA and EPA today. And then under an EDAM framework, it could drive, if you set up the rules in a way that you say, no, you can't report what we deem delivered elsewhere, then you're going to impact what they report as serving their own load to under these kind of more national requirements, which may result in them looking, I'm just going to use this loosely, so apologies to folks, dirtier than they really are. And we do think that's an unacceptable outcome. Thank you.
Okay, great. So thanks everybody. So we've got some different metrics up here by which we can assess this design objective. Shreyas, if you wouldn't mind opening the poll, I want to give folks a chance to share their opinions here. So if I remember correctly, what happens is a window will pop up on your screen, and it'll give you a chance to open the poll, click on your option, and then you have to press submit. So don't forget to press submit, and that will weigh in your response. And we've got about 45 more seconds to respond, and then we'll gather those results up as a group and take a look at them. And if you're having any technical issues, please send a note to the event producer to see if we can help you out with this. All right, we got about 10 more seconds. Don't forget to press submit. All right, Shreyas, can we pull up the results?
Yes, so there are still 12 more seconds left. Those who have not submitted your responses, please make sure you submit them.
All right. So we got 92 no answers. And then we have a pretty even distribution across those. I'm not sure if you guys can see my screen. Oh yeah, you can see it on your own. So we've got 9 highs, 4 medium high, 5 medium, 4 low, and 4 medium low, and 2 low. And then we've got some folks who don't think that there's enough information. So pretty widely distributed, but a little bit more heavily weighted on the high side. So let's move on to leakage is minimized. All right, so we've got the objective here is leakage should be minimized. And what I've done on this one, let me give us a little space. All right. So this design objective, I think we can assess it qualitatively and quantitatively as we've discussed. So from a qualitative perspective, I'm just, this is, again, these are just my ideas. I want to let folks hop in and weigh in on it. Leakage due to secondary dispatch is still present in this approach. That's the only type of leakage that I'm characterizing here. However, I would note that several modifications have been included to mitigate this issue partially, which is limiting the GHG attribution to the difference between the upper economic limit and the base schedule, which, as we were discussing, might come from the RSE optimization results. That's the current resource-specific approach. But again, we're going to hear more about that in a couple weeks. And then the next one is limiting the GHG attribution to the net export from the GHG zone. So let's just assess this one based on the RSE optimization results and not necessarily that potential improvement, just for the time being. And quantitatively, like I said, we don't have the time really to get this analysis out to the group, but we did, when we heard from the CAISO market analysis team, Abhishek Hundwale, he provided an estimate for the potential of secondary dispatch in the WEIM's real-time market. And based on those materials, which we talked through and are posted on the ISO website, the estimate for the WEIM is around 45 to 50%. And I don't think it's too far of a logical leap to say that it might carry through to the EDAM. So again, quantitative results are kind of pending, but this is how I thought that leakage was handled in this approach. Does anyone have any alternative ways that we would assess how leakage might work, or leakage might be minimized? How would we would assess this particular objective? Oh, I see one from Kathleen. Kathleen, how do you think we should assess this leakage should be minimized goal here?
Yeah, no, I think it's fine. Actually, I think Abhishek's slides are great. I'm looking at them. It's a good place to start. I would assume these values. So my assumption is that in an EDAM, the amount of potential secondary dispatch would increase relative to the numbers that Abhishek provided that we see in EIM. And if we can't do any quantifying of that, that is the most logical assumption to me, because the size of the problem and the objective is much larger. There's a lot more moving pieces. With that said, I think I just wanted to note that if you look at this box plot, while a lot of the ranges may fall kind of like on average within that, I think it is meaningful to me that there are times that is well over 80% that there is secondary dispatch. That's the majority of what we're discussing. That's a high majority to say that there's 80% of secondary dispatch in EIM, and with the concern that there is. So I just think I think you have to look at everything. You have to consider the outlier risk. You have to consider the range of the box plot. I just don't think you can look at a box and whisker plot and take the median or average for the purpose of this conversation. So I'm looking at the whole thing when I'm assessing it, and it looks pretty high to me.
Okay, cool. Let's get some input. Let's see, Alva, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, this is Alva from PG&E. Just to take the opposite side of it, which means I think that your 50% is probably a good starting point. Is the other possibility is that the aim of an EDAM would be that the baseline should be as close to zero as possible, considering the potential desire of EDAM participants to self-allocate, say, the clean energy, as was the previous topic of discussion, by self-scheduling. That self-scheduling is unlikely, it can't really be paired with a decremental bid in the current setup of the EDAM. So I would see potentially very little prospect of leakage coming out of the model, just to present an alternative assessment.
Yeah, okay. So you're saying that folks in the EDAM might be self-scheduling their resources, which might limit the ability for leakage. Is that,
Either self-scheduling if they don't want to enable their renewables to go elsewhere, or scheduling from zero, because the whole point of EDAM is to enable improvements in commitment, and that implies starting from zero. You can't have commitment unless you have your schedule starting from zero.
True. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Alva. Next up, we have maybe give Todd Ryan a chance to weigh in. Todd, do you have anything?
Yeah, to add on to Alva, sorry, this is Todd Ryan from PG&E. I would think that there's a potential for secondary dispatch to be lower, given that the baselines are going to be a counterfactual that ought to be closer to the real-time optimal solution than we have today, where we're all independently, all the different BAAs are independently optimizing. So there is a potential for secondary dispatch to be accounted for through the counterfactual and less deviation from day ahead to real time.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Todd. I see Jeff Spires has his hand raised. Jeff, do you want to go ahead?
Thanks, Kevin. Jeff Spires of PowerX. Just a few comments here about this and some of the other topics that have already been raised. I think we need, from PowerX's point of view, we need to acknowledge what we do know about the EIM, given the information we have. And that is that we know that the deeming algorithm preferentially selects the cleanest resources to be deemed delivered to California, that results in inaccurate attribution from a GHG perspective. It results in leakage. It allows emitting resources to displace clean resources, and ultimately those lower the price and diminish the price signal that for clean resources to be participating. And so in our view, those are just not acceptable outcomes, particularly because they're undermining the environmental policy objectives that the GHG pricing's intended to achieve in the first place. And so I think, with that in mind, we really need to recognize that we are talking about potentially a much larger market in the EIM, a successful day-ahead market that gains the broadest participation across the region would most likely replace the existing bilateral markets. And so the impact of a poorly designed solution here would have a far greater consequence than some of the issues we've already been seeing in the EIM. And I just do not believe that we should be taking something that we already know doesn't work in the context of the EIM and be expanding upon it. I really struggle with that. And I think that is in addition to some of the very valid issues that have been raised during these workshops about recognizing that another significant factor is GHG is not limited to California anymore. We have growing numbers of jurisdictions that are looking at GHG pricing, but also other clean energy, renewable energy portfolio standards. And, with that in mind, this idea of the market operator deciding how those outcomes play out and which resources are being used to meet which objectives and which programs seems increasingly problematic. So in our view, we are our belief is that we need to start with the zonal approach and have certain criteria that include the intent and the ability for the resource participant themselves to decide how their resources are going to be used.
Okay, so
Yeah,
probably fair to say that you think that this design objective is maybe met medium low or even low.
Yes, I do not believe the deeming algorithm prevents leakage at all, and I think it will grow as we add more resources and expand the market size.
Okay, thanks. The next thing I saw go up was Phil Schofield's. Phil, would you go ahead?
Yeah, Phil Schofield, Southern California Edison. I am reacting to a couple comments about out-of-state programs and the concern that the EDAM could divert renewables from somebody out of state who's got those contracts to meet their local requirements. But we still bid, right? There's still a bid that would be, I am willing to participate in the California or whatever, the GHG market in this region, and here's how much, and here's my GHG price. EDAM would not commandeer renewables that other load serving entities have under contract for their own state purposes, would it? Only bids would be exercised to transfer. So if you don't want your renewables to exit, you don't bid them. You put a zero GHG bid on them, 0 megawatt bid.
Mm-hmm.
Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So leakage is not commandeering things. Leakage is, if I'm indifferent between it staying in my non-GHG region or going to California or Washington, then I'll put a bid in on it. If I prefer it to go one place, I'll bid one way. If I prefer it to stay, I'll bid another way. But I still have the control through my bids as to where this goes.
Yeah, I think that's a good perspective.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Okay, the next hand that I saw, let's see. Folks, if you no longer have a question, please lower your hand, but I'll go to Dan Williams.
Kevin, Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. Just responding real quick to Southern California Edison's point there real quick. I mean, I think the difficulty here, though, is that as states and as utilities pursue 30, 50, 100% clean resources, if you start pulling clean resources out of the market optimization, through bids, you kind of reach a point of diminishing returns of even having a market in the first place. So, I just would caution sort of thinking too far down that road, though I do understand that there is some validity to it in the market as it exists today. The real question I had, though, was on when you were talking about the qualitative aspect of this item. Did you say that we should set aside the idea that was presented last time of limiting the GHG attribution to the next net export of megawatts? Because it seemed like there was some potentially some significant problems and some overlaps with the other working groups on kind of what that could mean, some unintended consequences, those sorts of things. But if we're setting that aside when we vote, then I don't know, maybe we should just note that.
Yeah, sorry. What I was saying is we should set aside the potential modification that we're going to discuss on the 15th in evaluating this objective. But in terms of evaluating this objective, we should consider whether leakage is minimized by limiting the GHG attribution to the net exports. But again, we're assessing in terms of leakage, not the other qualitative aspects that were discussed in the. Does that answer your question? The sort of.
I guess so. I guess from the discussion that was had last time, it feels like I'd be voting in favor of something that seems highly problematic, achieving a result, and that doesn't feel good. But I'll leave it there.
Understood. Yeah, and that's why there's 7 design objectives. This one's just focused on leakage. But there will be hopefully the other design objectives that we build together capture those other things. Let's see. Yeah, I think we'll get to that in the market efficiency one. So I'm going to take one more question, and then I want to open up the poll so we can keep the conversation moving. Kathleen, I think you had a response back.
Yeah, no, thanks, Kevin, for letting. I both agree with what Dan just clarified, but I wanted to also help with the response to Phil. I don't disagree with his clarification or your agreement. I wanted to zoom in on the issue that is underlying is it'd be an adverse impact if all clean resources are now not available, even when there's surplus supply from them during certain time periods. So I believe we've talked about this, but if it hasn't been clear, there is this issue of wanting when there's excess or surplus supply available from clean resources that would not have is not going to serve that load first. Having that count towards being deemed is completely acceptable, right? It's the incremental dispatch. So if your loading level absent transfers puts you at somewhere on, let's say, your hydro stack, and then you open transfers and you still have excess headroom on your hydro stack, that could be used for a transfer that could be deemed that can come from clean energy, and you're in a better off of position for that to be made available to the EDAM than if you take a stance and say bid megawatt in or out, because then you take the entire resource out. Instead of saying let's bid the megawatt to be available, let's ensure that the amount that would be dispatched for that load is not deemed, but the amount that is inked up for the transfer is deemed, is really a better off position for the greenhouse gas zone area than if you were to say, too difficult, just don't submit your bid megawatt. So I just wanted to zoom in on the challenge of taking that implementation approach, as it's less, it just minimizes the ability of the fleet to coordinate across the entire fleet when there is surplus from those resources. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, guys. So just in the interest of time, I'm going to move on. I want to, Shreyas, if you wouldn't mind opening the poll on this one. Remember, folks, you have 60 seconds to respond, and don't forget to press submit before you do. So, Shreyas, if you wouldn't mind opening, yep, that's perfect. All right, folks, 3 more seconds. Or 20 more seconds, sorry. All right, 3, 2, 1. All right. Thanks, Shreyas. Would you mind showing the results to the group?
Yeah, so there are 10 more seconds for the attendees to submit their responses.
Okay. All right. All right, so we've got a distribution with, we got 3 highs, 8 medium highs, 8 mediums, 3 medium low, and 11 low. So I can't do the math in my head right now, but it seems like we're trending towards somewhere around medium, low to medium. That's interesting. I think that kind of came out in the conversation today that we just had. So thanks everybody for participating. And we got a better response rate on that one too, which was good news. I'm glad to see that we're getting more folks to hop in. All right, thanks, Reyes. We'll move on to the next question. I'll let you know when we want to open up the next poll. That was great. All right, moving on. We've got this design objective number 3, which is that we should enable similarly situated / similar technology resources in a non-GHG zone to compete on a level playing field with resources inside the GHG zone and vice versa. So I think you'll see that this one has some shared elements with number 1, but I looked at it as having sort of 3 dimensions. So 1 is comparing the situation of emitting and non-emitting generation. 2 is whether the generating resource is in a non-GHG zone or in a GHG zone, and then determining whether that generating resource is serving its own load or non-native load. And what I've done here is I'll just give us a little bit extra space here. So I put in some just simplifying assumptions to make it a little easier for analysis. So let's assume that there are only 2 generating resources and 2 loads, one each for there's a 1 generating resource and 1 load in the GHG zone, and 1 generating resource and 1 load in the non-GHG zone. Let's assume that the emitting resources have the same emissions rate and that everybody sets their bids equal to their marginal costs. Marginal GHG bids are reflected implicitly in the GHG zone's generating resource bids and explicitly in the non-GHG zone's bid adder. This is how it works in the EIM today and how the resource-specific approach is proposed to work. And when calculating LMPs and settlements, the GHG bid adder is not considered when a non-GHG zone is serving its own non-native load. And then finally, let's just not think about losses and congestion. So let's look at, here, sorry, okay. So for emitting resources, we have, sorry, folks, trying to get this all in one page. There we go. Okay. So if an emitting resource is in a non-GHG zone and it's serving its own native load, it will appear to be relatively cheaper than emitting generation in the GHG zone to serve the non-GHG zone's load. And this is what we were talking about earlier. This is a product of the carbon price being imposed on the GHG zone's generation. If that non-GHG zone is serving the GHG zone's load, so it's non-native load, it will be priced similar because it's reflecting those GHG costs in the GHG bid adder. And then similarly, if the GHG zone resource is serving its own load, it will be similarly priced because the non-GHG zone's generating resources are including that GHG bid adder. And then emitting generation in the GHG zone will be relatively cheaper, more expensive to serve the non-GHG zone load compared to the non-GHG zone's load serving its own load, or resource serving its own load. So in my mind, I looked at these as being all appropriate because, you know, the non-GHG zone, the reason why their generation is cheaper is because they're not subject to the carbon price, whereas the GHG zone's energy is subject to that carbon price. And it's only an issue, or the non-native or the non-GHG zone's generation is only saddled with the GHG burden when it's serving the GHG zone's load. So that's how I looked at this question. Does anyone have any different ways of looking at this or just thoughts on this idea? saw that Alva has his hand raised. Alva, do you want to go ahead? And this is just in the context of emitting resources. We'll get to resources.
I agree with your perspective. I think a level playing field is one in which two resources with the same emissions are responsible for procuring the same allowances if they're both delivering to California. And I think you went through the logic more painstakingly just now, but I think that's a level playing field, and it's actually one of the difficulties I have with the hurdle rate approach. Is that requirement necessarily going to be met in that case? So.
Okay. I see Dan has his hand up. Dan.
Sorry, forgot to lower.
It's okay. Kathleen.
Hi, this is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. These might be more questions than anything else, but one of the things one of the things I struggle with in the greenhouse bid adder approach is that I'm not aware, so I'm not familiar with, Kevin, if you are, and you can clarify, this would be helpful. I'm not familiar with there explicitly being a requirement that the greenhouse gas bid adder represent the carb allowance price times that resource specific emission rate when it's submitted, to kind of tie it to a tariff requirement and violation if not followed. I'm also not familiar with any mitigation applied to it. Can you confirm my understanding, or is one of those in effect?
Yeah, good question. So no, there's no requirement to do that. The GHG bids are just subject to a limit, which is they can't bid in above a bid cap, which is a function of that allowance price multiplied by the resource's highest heat rate. So the least efficient operating point of the resource. So those are the only requirements on the GHG bid. But under this assumption, or under this, I put in some simplifying assumptions that they would bid in their marginal costs, which would be a function of the emissions rate and the allowance rate, I would expect. Is that helpful?
It is sort of helpful. I will be honest, so I don't believe in that. I don't know if I believe in that assumption. And it's not that I don't know 100%. I just, coming at this from, market design perspective, being conscientious about the fact that bids can be used to represent different things. If there is no requirement to do that, I don't think we should be assuming folks are doing that unless you explicitly put it in a manual or a tariff, and so it becomes a potential violation if even monitoring identifies it. So I recognize you put that assumption there. I think that is too gross of an assumption because it really drives one of the main concerns that I've always had with this idea that it's similar situated. I don't know. And I don't know if you have any reporting on it to give me confidence that the greenhouse gas bid adders that are being submitted from the non-greenhouse gas areas are always at what their heat rate point, their emission rate, and the allowance price would look like. That is reporting you could do. You could do that analysis and kind of give us some assurance, I think. But maybe consider doing that.
Yep. Okay, well, thanks. We'll take that under consideration. So I'll move on to the non-emitting resources. This analysis is a little bit simpler. The idea is if a non-generating resource, non-GHG zone generating resource is serving its own load, it'll be similarly priced to the non-GHG zone. Basically, they're all similarly priced because I don't want to go into the details here because we're running short on time, but in terms of just how the bids are reflected in the market and the payments that would come from it if the prices were based on marginal costs, there would be no GHG impact because these are non-emitting resources. So I will go to Callie, and then I want to open up the poll after that. So Callie, go ahead.
Hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF, and I actually had a comment on the emitting resource table that you had up prior. So do you mind scrolling back to that?
I do not.
Thank you. So I was curious, I don't know if this is the right objective to capture this scenario or interaction. If there's another one that this is better suited for, please let me know. But because of how this proposal deems megawatts delivered to the GHG zone and allows it to go into its baseline and does not limit it to incremental dispatch above its baseline, there is that scenario where all the clean resources in the non-GHG region are deemed delivered to California. I'm sorry, I'm using California just because that's what I'm used to, but deemed delivered to the GHG zone, and then an external emitting resource is dispatched up instead of the internal generating resource. So there is that interaction. Maybe it's a secondary interaction, but I was wondering where that nuance of this proposal would be captured. And I know you've alluded to it. We've done some testing on an alternate option that we think is worthy of consideration that does limit the deeming to above the baseline. Obviously, we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. But where, when we're evaluating this proposal, where does that, which objective does that scenario get reflected in?
Let me think on that while the poll is open, so we can continue moving on. But it's a good question, and I don't want to forget about it. So, folks, I'll ask Shreyas to open up the poll one more time. Again, the objective that we are looking at here is whether the resource-specific approach enables similarly situated or similar technologies in a non-GHG zone to compete on a level playing field with resources inside the GHG zone and the other way around. So let us know what you think. We got a minute and 19 seconds. That's a minute from now. You can respond. All right, folks, we got about 10 more seconds to respond, and then I'll ask you to click submit. Don't forget to click submit. All right, Shreyas, how does it look?
We have 14 more seconds. Please submit your responses.
All right, so the question was, does it enable similarly situated resources to sort of be played, transacted on a level playing field? We got 12 high, well, so we got about, let's see, 35 responses, 25 responses, and we've got 12 high, 5 medium high, 6 medium, 1 medium low, and 4 low. And then some folks who didn't think that they have enough information to answer. So I think that one trends a little bit more to the higher spectrum. So that's good to hear. Interesting to understand where you folks are. So just in the interest of time, I'll move on to item number 4 here, which is that it does not inadvertently undermine RPS or CES policies. And here was my take on this, which was that for the most part, RPS and CES policies are independent from the market optimization, and that I recognize that there's some concern about double counting. I think there are some workarounds to that issue, but I'm also responsive to the points brought up that in an ideal world that the market could help enable those transactions. Yeah, that's sort of where I'm at. Does anyone have any thoughts about how we would assess this goal or qualitative opinions on how well this goal is met. I see Anurag raise your hand. Anu, would you go ahead and introduce yourself first, please?
Sure. Yeah, this is Anu from LADWP, and I apologize, Kevin, I've been in and out of the meeting. I wasn't sure this was discussed. It's in regards to the third objective, and I know you closed the poll, but quickly at least wanted to bring up the discussion point of GHG zones being based on BA boundaries versus geographic boundaries, if that was considered. If you guys have already talked about it, if someone from LA has brought that up, I am okay to leave that alone for now. But I think we had mentioned on the onset of these sessions that there are instances where emitting resources in the GHG BA-based boundary are not similarly priced or dispatched into non-GHG zones, because these are outside the geographic boundary, and hence there may not be any reporting compliance obligations, but I believe the CAISO model, just because it's based on the BA boundary, does not support the playing field approach right now. Does that make sense? Yep. Did you guys get a chance to talk about that?
Yeah, so this might be a good chance to review that. So we have posted, the CAISO policy team had put together this document, which is a summary of the resource-specific approach. And in that, they mention that they're proposing to change the area that's being considered. Sorry, I'm trying to get to the right. So they're saying they're no longer proposing to use the BAA boundaries, but rather have it be dependent on the GHG regulation area. In other words, is that resource subject to GHG regulation, which I think would address your concern.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you all. I'm behind on reviewing all these documents, and I'm guessing I'm not the only one, but thank you for pointing it out.
No problem. Good to hear from you. All right, folks, I'm not seeing any other hands raised, so I'd like to open this poll up so we can keep the clip moving on. Actually, hold on. I do see some hands raised. Todd Jones, would you go ahead?
Hi, can you hear me, Kevin?
Yeah.
Hi, this is Todd Jones from Center for Resource Solutions. So related to this fourth objective, I think I think I've sort of made our position on this clear, in that the extent to which this approach meets this objective, I think, depends on whether or not there can be, some coordination or data sharing with Regis, and sort of harmonization between resource-specific attribution that occurs in the market and attribution that occurs in Regis. And I did see, and I see that you're bringing up now, the summary that was posted. There's some acknowledgement that folks at CAISO think that can be incorporated into this. So if the proposal for this resource-specific approach, I didn't see anything in that summary document that definitively said that this will include that sort of data sharing. I think it said something like it could. And so I think the extent to which it meets this objective depends on, from our perspective, whether or not that actually occurs, if that's clear.
Yeah, that's fair. Let's see. So, yeah, I think the document says, let's see, it anticipates that it could support data sharing, and I recognize that there's some uncertainties there. I'm not sure how it works from like a legal perspective, for example, but duly noted that is a relevant consideration, in this. So thanks for raising that, Todd.
Yeah, and I just wanted to share with the group that, we submitted a more sort of specific recommendation or proposal about what exactly the design could say regarding this to you all for your consideration. I'd be happy to share that as well with anyone who's interested.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. Kathleen, I see your hands raised, but I do want to see if we can at least get through one more of these design objectives. Folks, Shreyas, if you wouldn't mind opening up the poll for question number 4, and we're assessing how well the resource-specific approach, as explained by the ISO, does or does not inadvertently undermine RPS policies. So let's assume, just for the sake of responses, that if it does inadvertently undermine RPS policies, you would rate it low. And if it does not, you can rate it high. And if anyone rated it the wrong way, message me and I will subtract your answer. It's a little unclear how you would respond. But again, if you think that it does a good job of not undermining, you would rate it high. And if you think it does a poor job, rate it low. Thanks. All right. Shreyas, how much more time do we have?
We have 11 more seconds for the participants to submit their responses.
Okay. All right, folks. Another pretty evenly distributed one. If you look at just the pure numbers, it looks like it trends a little bit more to the high, but another even distribution on this one. So interesting results. What I'm going to propose to do is try to get one more of these out of the way and then continue this conversation in a subsequent meeting, just so we can get all of these discussions completed. So what I want to do is just very briefly in the next 5 minutes, if possible, see if we can characterize how well this approach allows for market efficiency by accurately reflecting relevant costs, including GHG compliance costs. So in my mind, this approach does allow for accurate representation of GHG costs, because those costs can be reflected in emitting resources bids, and therefore the market is using the appropriate costs in its dispatch, and those costs are appropriate based on the policies that they are subject to. Does anyone else have any other takes on this, or different ways to analyze this question, or different metrics that you would use to assess this question? Feel free to raise your hand. If not, I'll go to Kathleen. Kathleen, do you have any thoughts on this one?
I just have a process request, actually. So, Mary and Callie and others had noted that what we talked about in the beginning, baseline accuracy and deemed megawatt appropriateness, while that is relevant to number 1, it's also relevant, so we mentioned it overlaps others. So I think it's worth noting in your document here which one. So I believe it also overlaps number 4, which I know you closed out. I just wanted you to note that. Okay. I think it also is in number 6 and number 7. And I just say all those, Kevin, to save me having to raise my hand every time you go.
Okay, cool. Noted. So we're considering number 5 now, but when we get to 6 and 7, let's not forget that, and I'll do my best to raise it. So does anyone else have different thoughts on how well the resource-specific approach allows for market efficiency? I see Dan Williams has his hand raised. Dan, can you go ahead?
Yeah, super quick, Dan Williams, Customized Energy Solutions. I think that point that I raised earlier about concerns about the constraint on the export limit could be relevant here in number 5 as well, if it forces GHG bid prices down to 0 in an area that may not sort of accurately represent things, depending on what else we sort through in that proposal.
Okay, so yeah, the net transfer limit might create differential GHG pricing between zones, between non-GHG zones. Okay, does that capture it, do you think? I'm gonna hope so. All right, let's do one last poll, and then I want to give Brian a chance to do a recap. So Shreyas, could you open up the last poll, and then we will close this thing out. Thanks. All right, guys, just a few more seconds to respond, so please submit those. All right, Shreyas, I'm ready. Yep. All right. So we're seeing about 30 responses here. So we've got 10 each on high and medium high, 2 in medium, and 4 in medium low, and 4 in low, as well as some folks who didn't have enough info to answer. So another interesting poll result, and thank you folks for voting and participating. I am going to give Brian a chance to do a brief recap, talk about what we're going to do next meeting, and then if there's time, I recognize that Mary and Claire had their hands up, so I want to give them a chance too. So Brian, can you do a quick recap of today?
Yep, thank you, Kevin. Okay, so we first started with a discussion of a resource-specific summary based on the scope document. Kevin highlighted a few follow-up items that were incremental to where we left that discussion in the previous session. And there was a couple items discussed on that part of the meeting. One was a proposal or a request to consider an alternative for the baseline process, and then another request to expressing the value in a model approach to testing and evaluate in a quantitative sense some of the various approaches that we've been talking about. And then we moved on to these design objectives and the polling options. We spent a few minutes talking about the process that Kevin would go through to discuss and then activate the poll. That we wanted to first discuss and review his take on how to evaluate each of the objectives, and for each offering discussion on amending that the perspective on how to perceive the assessment, and then a question on how will the results be used. It was clarified this is really just to get a feel collectively where we feel now, and the poll results will not be used for anything more than that. So then we got through 5 of the items. The first item, the inappropriate impact on non-GHG zones. This led to a substantive discussion on the accuracy of the baseline and how that would impact this objective, and then also whether base schedules can be the scenario where base schedules can be deemed outside of the zone, and then what the implication of that is on the general impact across the zones. The poll there showed about an even distribution, maybe slightly higher towards the high, but generally speaking, all of the polls were fairly well distributed with only a slight lean. The second discussion on leakage, minimizing leakage, here we got into a discussion of whether, to the extent that folks thought that the Cal ISO estimated 45 to 50% leakage would increase or stay the same as we look ahead to a forward market, and then also to the extent to which RPS and CES obligations could be managed by bid options. And then that poll showed low to medium compliance, if you will, with the objective. I'm sorry, we're just about to run out of time here, so let me speed up. So number 3, the polling showed about a medium distribution on enabling similar resources, a level playing field. And then again, quickly, item number 4 does not undermine RPS policies, CES policies. That was, again, about an even distribution. And then the last one was a slightly higher than even distribution towards medium to high on the market efficiency. Okay. Thanks, Kevin. Back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And sorry, folks, that we're cutting out of time. On Tuesday, we'll talk about the unspecified zonal approach and try to workshop some of the remaining issues. But before we do that, I want to finish out this resource-specific approach evaluation. And Claire and Mary, sorry, we ran out of time, but I'm going to carve out time right at the beginning of Tuesday's workshop so you can raise your points. I'm really sorry that we didn't get a chance to do it today. So apologies for that, and thank you for your understanding and holding on to your questions. So thanks everybody for joining in the working group evaluation. We're not done, but I think we made some really good progress today. So have a great weekend, everybody, and thank you again. Appreciate it.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.